Miracles and science, two concepts that, at first glance, seem to be in completely different fields. However, what if the miracles we witness have a scientific explanation? Could it be that, in some way, God uses the natural laws He created to manifest His power? In this text, we will explore how science might attempt to explain the supernatural, without diminishing divine grandeur. The Tower of Babel, a mysterious linguistic phenomenon, could be unraveled by science, but what does this reveal about God's action in our lives? Since the dawn of humanity, the quest to understand the world around us has been a constant. Science, with its laws and rational explanations, has provided us with an increasingly deep understanding of nature and the universe. However, many still wonder, how does science relate to God? Are scientific discoveries a reflection of divine creation or simply a coincidence? The answer lies in the very structure of the universe, in the order and complexity it reveals. For those who believe in God as the Creator, science is not the enemy of faith but a way to understand divine grandeur. From the first day of creation, when God separated the light from the darkness, He not only created the universe but established natural laws that would govern everything. The movement of the stars, the formation of the stars, the life that springs from the soil, everything is governed by these laws, which are an extension of God's power. When we look at the laws of physics, such as gravity, or the biological laws that sustain life, it is impossible not to see the divine touch in each of these systems. The order that permeates chaos, the precision with which particles organize themselves, is a signature of a sovereign creator. By studying science, we are, in fact, investigating the way God structured and shaped the universe. Every scientific discovery, no matter how complex, reveals a piece of the divine plan. However, it is important to understand that science alone cannot account for the totality of creation. It offers us a limited view, a human perspective that is always seeking answers. God, on the other hand, is eternal and omniscient, beyond the human capacity to comprehend. Science, therefore, cannot fully explain the mysteries of creation but allows us to glimpse the wonder and perfection of God's work. When we study nature, the stars, and the laws that govern the world, we are, in fact, experiencing a reflection of God's infinite power and wisdom. This does not mean that science replaces faith, but rather that it complements it. Divine creation is like a great book, and science offers us the tools to read that book. However, like any good book, the divine work is filled with mysteries and elements that cannot be fully understood, even by science. The beauty of creation is that the more we know, the more we realize there is so much more to learn, and each new scientific discovery is an opportunity to draw even closer to the Creator. In summary, science and faith are not opposites but two ways of understanding the same world. Science explores natural laws, but faith reminds us that these laws are a reflection of God's power. When we look at the universe, we don't just see stars and planets in motion, we see the hand of God, who created them and sustains them. The creation and the science of God are intertwined, and each discovery invites us to recognize divine greatness and wisdom. Biblical miracles have always been a source of fascination and questioning. How can something that defies the laws of nature happen? If God is sovereign and the creator of all things, how can He interact with the world in such extraordinary ways? The Bible is filled with events that seem to violate natural laws, such as the parting of the Red Sea or the multiplication of loaves and fishes. However, it is possible that behind these miracles, there are scientific explanations that, far from diminishing God's power, help us see His power even more deeply. Let's consider the example of the multiplication of the loaves and fishes, when Jesus fed a crowd of over 5,000 people with just 5 loaves and 2 fishes. From a scientific perspective, this might seem impossible. Physics and biology tell us that it is not possible to feed so many people with such a small amount of food. However, the scientific explanation does not diminish the miracle. In a sense, it may even suggest a new understanding of how God works through natural laws. Some scholars suggest that the multiplication of the loaves and fishes could be explained through a psychological phenomenon known as the contagion effect. When people witness a generous act or something unusual happen, such as sharing a meal, they may be inspired to act similarly. Upon seeing the offering of a small number of loaves and fishes, people may have begun sharing what they had, causing the resources to expand naturally. However, this does not change the fact that it was Jesus who initiated the act, and that the miracle indeed occurred. Science can suggest an explanation for human behavior, but the divine action is at the heart of the event. Another powerful example is the healing of the blind and the sick, such as the story of the man born blind who was healed by Jesus after being touched and ordered to wash in the pool of Siloam. The scientific explanation for this could be a combination of natural medical treatments or even the placebo effect, where faith and the expectation of healing generate positive results in the body. However, this explanation does not erase the fact that it was Jesus who was the agent that initiated the healing process. The power of God, operating through natural laws, is what makes the miracle real, regardless of the scientific explanations that attempt to understand the mechanisms. This is where science and faith can coexist harmoniously. God, in His infinite wisdom, created natural laws to ensure the world operates in an ordered and predictable way. However, He also has the power to act supernaturally within these laws, breaking or expanding the limits of what we know. Science can explain how certain things happen, but it can never fully explain the action of God behind them. What we see as a scientific explanation is often the means by which God chooses to act, using His own laws to fulfill His will. For example, when considering the healing of a paralytic, science may suggest that a combination of medical treatments, physiotherapy, or even a miraculous spontaneous recovery could have occurred. However, the scientific explanation does not negate the fact that it was God who provided the miracle, regardless of how science may understand the process. Even when science finds a plausible explanation, the action of God remains the crucial point that transforms the event into a miracle. Miracles, therefore, are not contrary to science but show how God's natural laws can be used to manifest His power in ways that transcend our understanding. Even if scientific explanations are possible, they will never diminish God's power. On the contrary, they invite us to see His greatness in a deeper and more mysterious way, revealing how God, through His creation, continues to act and operate in our world in supernatural ways. The key here is recognizing that, regardless of the scientific explanations we may seek, God is in control of everything. He is the author of creation, and it is through His power that miracles happen. Science may try to explain how something occurred, but it cannot explain why or by whom. And this is what makes every miracle, even those explained by science, a testimony to divine power. Science, in its relentless quest to understand the world and the universe, reveals something that many still do not fully recognize: the orderly functioning of nature is a reflection of divine wisdom and power. The laws of physics, biology, chemistry, and even mathematics are like the score of a grand symphony, written by God when He created the universe. When we observe these laws, we are actually perceiving the divine design that sustains all of existence. They are not merely an explanation for what happens, but a manifestation of God's infinite mind, who established everything with impressive precision. And although science provides us with tools to understand these processes, it will never be able to capture the purpose and intention of God behind them. Science can explain the how of things, but the why remains in divine sovereignty. God, as the creator of all things, established natural laws to ensure order and harmony in the cosmos. The laws of physics, such as gravity and the laws of motion, are clear examples of this divine power. Gravity, for instance, is not merely a physical force that pulls objects toward the Earth but a fundamental principle that maintains the stability of the universe. Without it, the Earth would have no orbit, stars wouldn't remain in their places, and life as we know it would be impossible. However, while science can describe how gravity works and the laws that govern it, it cannot explain why these laws exist or by whom they were created. The explanation of the origin of these laws is beyond human reach and is something that can only be attributed to divine power. When we look at the world around us, we see a universe governed by scientific principles. The way plants grow, how animals adapt to their environment, and how stars move in the sky are not mere chance or randomness. On the contrary, they are direct results of laws that God established to keep everything in balance. Modern physics provides us with an explanation of how natural laws work, such as the interactions of subatomic particles, but even these explanations are not sufficient to answer the fundamental question: why do these laws exist? For Christians, the answer is clear: they exist because God created them to manifest His order and power. Let us also consider the laws of thermodynamics, which govern the exchange of energy and the behavior of particles. These are essential for the functioning of our planet, from the heat that sustains life to the chemical reactions that allow living organisms to grow and multiply. Science can explain these processes in terms of energy, heat, and particle movement, but it will never be able to explain why these laws were created and how God implemented them with such precision. The fact that these laws work in perfect harmony, maintaining life and the universe in balance, is a testimony to God's power and precision. Every chemical reaction, every cell that divides, and every atom that moves follows a path determined by these divine laws. The beauty of science, then, lies not only in understanding natural processes but in realizing that these laws are a reflection of the Creator. Physics, for example, does not explain where gravitational force comes from, but it reveals its presence and importance in our universe. Likewise, biology teaches us about the complexity of cells and the processes that sustain life, but it cannot answer who initiated that complexity. Science, in its essence, is a tool that allows us to look more closely at God's design, but no matter how much we understand it, there will always be a layer of mystery that transcends our comprehension. Science allows us to see a part of God's glory, but it still keeps us humble before His infinite power. In fact, the limitation of science is one of the things that makes the relationship between science and faith so powerful. Science is a way of seeking to understand the details of the world created by God, but it will never be able to fully explain the purpose and reason for all things. No matter how much we unravel the mysteries of biology, physics, or astronomy, there will always be something beyond the reach of the human mind. As limited human beings, our understanding of God's creation is confined to our capacity to comprehend, and that is why faith becomes an essential key to understanding what science cannot reveal. This becomes particularly evident when we encounter the deeper questions about the origin of the universe, life, and consciousness. Science can trace the timeline of the creation of the universe, from the Big Bang to the formation of the first stars, planets, and eventually, life. But the question of why the universe exists and what the purpose of human life is lies beyond the scope of science. It is at this point that faith enters, reminding us that everything we see and understand is part of a larger divine plan, which cannot be fully comprehended with our limited resources. God, in creating the natural laws, not only made the world function in an orderly manner but invited us to look at what He made with admiration and reverence. Therefore, science does not diminish God's control over the universe, it exalts it. The natural laws are like the instruments of a cosmic orchestra, and God is the maestro who conducts everything with wisdom and power. When we observe the laws of nature in action, we are actually contemplating the hand of God, who created and sustains them. Science, then, is not an obstacle to faith but a way of seeing the world from a new perspective, as a reflection of the divine mind that governs and sustains everything. As we discover more about how the world works, we can marvel even more at the greatness of God and recognize that, behind everything we know, is His infinite intelligence and sovereign will. Science, contrary to what some may think, is not the enemy of faith but a way to deepen our understanding of God. Every scientific breakthrough is, in fact, an opportunity to recognize God's power in action. Science gives us the ability to see and understand the details of how the universe works, but it will never replace the Creator who is behind it all. God did not only create the natural laws, He uses them to reveal His greatness, maintaining order and harmony in the universe. Even if science explains how a phenomenon occurs, it will never be able to fully explain why and by whom it happens. Every scientific discovery, no matter how fascinating, invites us to see the grandeur of the Creator. It reminds us that, no matter how much we understand, there will always be a layer of divine mystery that will remain beyond our comprehension. And it is within this mystery that we find the true beauty of God's creation, a beauty that science can explore, but will never fully explain. When we think about miracles, we often face a profound dilemma: are they simply natural phenomena that we still don't fully understand, or divine acts of direct intervention? The line between scientific explanation and miracles can seem blurry, but it is precisely here that the relationship between faith and science becomes even more fascinating. If science can explain many of the natural phenomena we perceive as miracles, does this, in some way, diminish God's role in them? Or does the scientific explanation merely reveal a greater layer of divine grandeur? This chapter aims to explore this question by choosing a specific miracle, analyzing possible scientific explanations, and at the same time reaffirming that, regardless of human explanations, the power of God remains the ultimate source of every extraordinary event. One of the most emblematic miracles in the Bible is the miracle of the parting of the Red Sea, an event that appears in the book of Exodus, where Moses, under God's command, divides the sea so that the Israelites can escape from the pursuit of the Egyptian army. For many, this is a classic example of direct divine intervention. However, over the centuries, scholars and scientists have tried to offer natural explanations for the phenomenon. Some theories suggest that a climatic event, such as a strong wind blowing for an extended period, could have caused the temporary division of the waters, creating a passage in the sea. This could be seen as a plausible scientific explanation for what happened. However, even if science can suggest a natural explanation for the phenomenon, the crucial question remains: how was it possible for such an event to occur precisely at the right moment, in an exact location, and with such impressive magnitude? Even if the wind played a crucial role, the coordination of all the elements, the perfect timing, the exact point of division of the sea, the safety of the Israelites as they walked on dry land, reveals more than mere coincidence or randomness. And that's where the role of God comes in. For the Christian, the miracle is not merely a natural phenomenon explained by meteorological conditions, it is the hand of God that orchestrated the events perfectly to fulfill His divine plan. Science may provide an explanation for how the waters could have parted, but it cannot explain why this happened at that moment, for those people, in response to a request from God. This is something that transcends scientific explanation and points directly to divine action. Science can show the how, but it is faith that reveals to us the why. The miracle of the parting of the Red Sea, like so many other supernatural events recorded in the Bible, is not merely an occurrence unexplained by science but a sign that God is in control of everything. He is not a distant God who created the world and left it at the mercy of natural laws. He is a present, active God, capable of using the laws of nature to manifest His will in a supernatural way. Another example of a natural phenomenon that many try to explain scientifically is the healing of diseases or afflictions. In the New Testament, there are numerous accounts of Jesus healing the blind, paralytics, lepers, and other sick individuals, miracles that were seen by many as proof of Christ's divine power. A classic case is the healing of a man born blind, as recounted in the Gospel of John. Jesus, in healing the blind man, uses earth and saliva to make a paste that He applies to the man's eyes, telling him to wash in the pool of Siloam. For many, this is simply a miracle, a divine intervention without logical or scientific explanation. However, some scholars attempt to seek a physiological or psychological explanation for these healings, suggesting that the man may have suffered from a treatable condition or that the healing was the result of a change in the patient's mental state. However, once again, even if science can offer an interpretation of how the human body could have been healed, the crucial question is, what caused this healing at the exact moment it happened? What was the factor that brought about the instant and miraculous healing? The answer lies in God's direct action. When Jesus healed, He did not use a common remedy or conventional medical treatments, He used His divine power, often defying the natural norms of healing. Even though medical treatments may have their efficacy, the miracle here is not just the healing itself, but the means by which God performs it. The miracle does not depend on human logic but on the divine authority that transcends all the limitations of science. In other words, miracles may occur within what we consider natural laws, but they are orchestrated and carried out by a God who transcends these laws. They are not contrary to science, but are phenomena that science has yet to fully explain. Science seeks to understand the workings of the natural world, while faith acknowledges that there is something beyond nature, something supernatural, that governs everything. The role of science is to understand how things work. The role of faith is to understand that, behind all the workings, there is a creator who uses nature to fulfill his purposes. In the case of miraculous healing, for example, we can understand the chemical reactions in the body and the physiological processes involved in recovery. However, this does not diminish the fact that God, according to his will, can perform a miracle at a specific moment to demonstrate his power. The same applies to other miracles we see throughout Scripture. The scientific explanation may speak about the phenomenon itself, but it cannot describe the divine plan behind what happened. Science tries to show us the workings of the universe, but faith allows us to see the divine purpose behind every event. Finally, the goal of reflecting on the relationship between natural phenomena and divine miracles is not to diminish science, but to understand that both perspectives can coexist. Science helps us understand the how of the natural world, while faith reveals to us the why of the divine. A miracle can be explained scientifically, but the hand of God remains at the center of every action. Science may attempt to describe the events, but faith teaches us that, in the end, God is the author and sustainer of all miracles. When examining the miracles recorded in the New Testament, we see an interesting pattern. Many of these extraordinary events challenged human logic and the scientific explanations of their time. However, as science evolves, new interpretations of these phenomena arise, some of them seemingly compatible with natural laws. Nevertheless, this in no way diminishes the supernatural nature and divine intervention behind these miracles. The New Testament reveals that the miracles of Jesus were not only manifestations of power but also acts of compassion, deep teachings, and demonstrations of his authority as the Son of God. While science may suggest explanations, it will never be able to fully grasp the divine mystery that surrounds these events. In this chapter, we will explore some miracles from the New Testament and reflect on how science and faith can coexist in harmony without contradicting God's supernatural action. One of the most emblematic miracles that challenged natural explanations was the multiplication of the loaves and fishes, an event recorded in all four Gospels. At a time when food scarcity was a constant concern, the sight of Jesus feeding a crowd of 5,000 men, not counting women and children, with only 5 loaves and 2 fishes is, for many, the definition of a miracle. The scientific explanation for this miracle has been the subject of speculation, but no theory can replicate the magnitude of the event. Some scholars suggest that perhaps the loaves and fishes were distributed in such a way that, when shared, everyone had enough to eat. However, this theory fails to explain the fact that after the meal, 12 baskets were left over with pieces. What seemed like a simple meal was transformed into a supernatural abundance, something that no natural explanation could fully justify. But, despite the scientific explanation being insufficient to explain the phenomenon satisfactorily, the miracle does not lose its power. Instead, the experience shows how Jesus' divine intervention in the midst of human need transcended the limitations of physics and biology. Science can attempt to show how something might be possible, but it cannot capture the essence of the miracle, which is ultimately an act of God in action. Similarly, the healing of a man born blind, recorded in John 9, challenges the natural explanations of how vision can be restored. Jesus, when healing the blind man, made a mixture with mud and saliva, which was placed on the man's eyes, telling him to wash in the pool of Siloam. The scientific explanation for the restoration of vision would be impossible to comprehend without divine intervention. Science may understand the mechanisms of the human eye and how it works, but it cannot explain how an instantaneous and supernatural healing occurs. The Christian faith teaches us that the healing was a direct act of Jesus, not just as a physical doctor but as the Son of God with the power to restore the wholeness of the human being. Body, soul, and spirit. This miracle, like all others in the New Testament, reveals that science and faith are not enemies but companions that can coexist in harmony. Science describes the functioning of the human body, nature, and physical laws, while faith teaches that God can act beyond these laws to fulfill his purposes. The scientific explanation, although valid in its attempt to understand the how, will never be able to answer the why behind each miracle. Another miracle from the New Testament that challenges science is Jesus walking on water. In Matthew 14 verses 22 to 33, we see Jesus going to his disciples, who were in a boat in the middle of the sea, and he walks on the water to reach them. The scientific explanation for such a phenomenon, according to the laws of physics, would be impossible, as the human body cannot float on water without sinking. Attempts to justify this miracle, such as suggestions that Jesus walked on a shallow part of the sea or that a natural phenomenon, like the freezing of the water, occurred, failed to capture the depth of the supernatural action. The scientific explanation, while interesting, does not change the fact that this is a unique miracle, a sign of Jesus' divine authority over the laws of nature. However, what science cannot capture is the deep meaning of this miracle. By walking on the water, Jesus was not only defying the laws of physics, he was revealing his absolute dominion over creation and showing that he is capable of doing the impossible. Faith teaches us that, while the laws of nature govern the material world, God is sovereign over them and can use them, or even transcend them, to fulfill his will. The crucial point to be understood in this chapter is that, while science may suggest explanations for certain natural phenomena, it cannot fully describe the divine action behind them. When Jesus performed miracles, he was showing that his authority was not limited to the natural laws that govern the universe, but that he had the power to transcend them, to act beyond what is possible for human beings. This does not diminish the importance of science, but it reminds us that, despite all its capacity to explain how the world works, it will never be able to explain the divine mystery that operates behind each miracle. The harmony between science and faith is, therefore, a reality. Science offers us a deep understanding of God's creation and how he ordered the laws of nature. However, faith allows us to see beyond these laws and understand that, even when natural phenomena occur, there is a divine hand that guides and directs everything to fulfill God's plan. We should not see science and faith as opposites, but as different ways of seeking the truth, one focused on the how and the other on the why. Both can coexist, for both ultimately point to the greatness and power of God. Although science has achieved remarkable feats throughout history, providing explanations for many phenomena that once seemed inexplicable, it is important to recognize a fundamental truth: science, no matter how advanced, will always have its limitations when it comes to understanding divine mysteries. God is eternal, immeasurable, and his nature transcends human understanding. Even though science allows us to understand many aspects of the natural world and its laws, it will never be able to fully describe the greatness and complexity of the Creator. The human limitation in understanding God is something that is acknowledged throughout the Scriptures. The book of Isaiah itself reminds us, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord," Isaiah 55 verse 8. This passage challenges us to perceive that, while we try to explain the functioning of the world through science, God is beyond our comprehension. He is an unfathomable mystery, and the natural laws that science describes are just one part of the vast divine plan. Science, with its theories and discoveries, can help us understand the how of things, but it cannot answer the why. For example, science can explain how the universe came into being, based on the Big Bang theory and the observation of the laws of physics. But it cannot explain why the universe exists in the first place, nor why the laws of physics are the way they are. The origin of life, the reason why something exists instead of nothing, is beyond the explanatory capacity of science. The Christian faith teaches us that God is the creator of all things, and this is something that science, by its nature, cannot fully address. Another clear example of this limitation can be seen when we try to understand miracles. Science may suggest plausible explanations for seemingly extraordinary events, but it will never be able to capture the fullness of the divine power involved. As much as science can explain how a person may heal from a disease or how water can be turned into wine through natural processes, it will never be able to comprehend how these events are directly related to the will of God, who accomplishes them in a supernatural way. God's actions are not limited to the laws of nature that science can study. He is the creator of these laws and, therefore, is free to act beyond them if he so desires. In the Bible, we see many moments when God's action cannot be explained by natural or scientific factors. The resurrection of Jesus, for example, is an event that goes beyond any scientific explanation. Science can understand human biology and how cellular processes work, but it cannot explain how a body that was dead for 3 days can come back to life. The resurrection is not something that science can measure or replicate, for it is a work of divine power. The Christian faith teaches us that Jesus not only rose from the dead, but that this resurrection is a sign of God's victory over death and sin, something that science cannot and will never be able to fully understand. This leads us to an important reflection. While science is a valuable tool for understanding the natural world and developing solutions to many human problems, it will never be able to provide answers to the deeper mysteries of life. Science can reveal the wonders of God's creation, but it cannot reveal the divine purpose behind creation. The answer to the why of existence, the meaning of life, and the reason for human suffering cannot be found solely in the observation of molecules or in the formulation of scientific theories. These answers come from faith, from God's revelation in our lives. Science, as powerful as it is limited to what can be observed, measured, and experienced in the natural world. God, on the other hand, is unlimited and transcends all the barriers that science tries to place upon him. He is the creator and sustainer of the universe, and his action is beyond the reach of our rational explanations. This does not mean that science and faith are mutually exclusive. On the contrary, they can coexist harmoniously, with science helping us understand the workings of the world and faith leading us to a deeper understanding of divine meaning and purpose. However, it is important to remember that science will never be enough to fully explain the nature of God. As human beings, our understanding is limited, and divine revelation shows us that there are dimensions of reality that we cannot comprehend with our senses or with our reason. As the Apostle Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 13 verse 12, "Now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I have been fully known." This reminds us that, while we are in this world, our understanding is limited and often obscure. Only in face-to-face communion with God will we be able to fully comprehend the mysteries He has revealed. Therefore, the mystery of God and His power is not something that can be fully explained or understood by science. Science, at its best, can lead us to recognize that the universe is a work of God and that the natural laws are, indeed, an expression of His power and wisdom. However, it will never be able to reveal all aspects of the divine plan. Only by faith can we understand the intimate relationship between the Creator and His creation, and this faith leads us to worship that transcends human reason. Science and faith, therefore, have different roles in our lives. Science teaches us the how of the universe, but faith reveals the why of existence. Science is a wonderful tool that allows us to explore the world around us, but faith allows us to glimpse God's eternal plan. Together, they can enrich our understanding of the world, but we should never forget that, ultimately, there are mysteries that can only be known through divine revelation. Ultimately, science, as much as it enlightens us, will never be able to fully explain God's power and nature. He is beyond what we can comprehend, and our journey of faith is, for the most part, a journey of recognizing our own limitations in the face of His infinite greatness. As we embrace both science and faith, we can walk humbly toward a greater understanding of the Creator, knowing that, while science is a valuable tool, the true knowledge of God transcends everything we can measure or explain. As we reflect on the relationship between science and divinity, it becomes clear that there is a profound mystery that permeates the entire universe. Science, with its ability to explain many natural phenomena, can offer us a fascinating glimpse into the order that God created. However, science, no matter how advanced, will always have its limits when it comes to understanding the totality of God's nature and His divine plan. God is more than the natural principles that we can observe or measure. He transcends human understanding. While the laws of physics, biology, and the sciences in general can help us understand how the world works, they cannot provide us with definitive answers to the deeper questions of existence, the purpose of life, the meaning of suffering, and the reason for our creation. The answer to these questions can only be found in faith, in divine revelation that surpasses human reason. The mystery of God, then, should not be seen as something that limits our understanding, but as an invitation to worship and humility. We may seek explanations and answers, but in the end, God remains beyond the reach of science. What we know for certain is that He is the creator of all, and His presence is felt in ways that go beyond what science can measure. He acts in the world, often in supernatural ways, challenging our rational explanations. Ultimately, science and faith do not need to be enemies. They can coexist in harmony, with science helping us understand the how of the world and faith revealing the why. However, the true understanding of God is beyond any scientific explanation, for He is greater and more wonderful than anything we can perceive or comprehend. Science can explore and explain the miracles of God, but it will never be able to capture the fullness of His divine power. Therefore, when we question the role of science in explaining miracles, we must remember that, while science seeks to understand what we see and measure, God is much greater than any formula or theory. He is the creator of all things, and His actions transcend all human capacity for understanding. Faith invites us to trust in His sovereignty and accept that, even amid the mystery, He is in control of everything. Will we ever be able to comprehend the totality of the divine plan? Or will our limited human vision always leave us with more questions than answers? The mystery of God continues, and the quest for understanding is eternal. However, in our hearts, we know that, no matter how much science advances, God will always be beyond our ability to understand, and that is, in a way, the greatest wonder of all.